My name is Sean Ade, and I'm a professor here at the School of Media and Public Affairs, and I'm also director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, which is part of SMPA and the Elliott School of International Affairs. And I'm happy to be co-hosting this event with the Institute of Middle East Studies, whose director Mark Lynch is back here. And this event is also sponsored by the Walter Roberts Endowment. We have a board member here in the back, Bruce Gregory. This is an event, we always do something at IPDGC in March around International Women's Month. And so we're really excited to have that be part of our programming. And the event today, I think, is going to be really terrific. We have an amazing panel. We've got some great films to show, or at least to preview. And so I want to get started as soon as possible. So without further ado, I want to introduce our host for the day, Tara Sonenshine, who is a distinguished fellow here at the School of Media and Public Affairs, and of course the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and also a member of the Women and Girls Leadership Council. So I'll turn it over to Tara, who can introduce the panelists and get us rolling.
Well, thank you very much. Students, anyone students here? Raise hands. Okay. Although not all of your colleagues made it, you are the lucky ones. And I say that because you are fortunate to hear from really fabulous experts and people who have studied the issue of the Arab Spring and women and girls and really have a lot to say, and the rest will have to watch it on video, I think. So let me begin by introducing Gini Reticker to you. And Gini has worked on a number of films about women and girls through this wonderful project that I'm going to have you just say a word about, and then we'll go down the line.
I've actually been making films about women for maybe 20 years, and I made a film a few years ago with my partner Abby Disney called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It was about women in Liberia and what they did to help end a civil war that had gone on for 14 years. That then led us to do a whole series called Women, War, and Peace. That was the opening series for Women and Girls Lead, and that was about women all over the world and global security. And now we're doing something called Awakening, a film that's about women in Egypt and Tunisia and during the Arab Spring and continuing on to today.
And we will see a little bit of the production of Women and Girls, and we'll see a little bit of the film, this trailer.
The trailer, right.
Good. Joining us also from International Crisis Group, and those of you who don't follow ICG, please go immediately after this and look it up. But Sahar Atrache is from both the Beirut, Lebanon office and here. She's worked on UN issues, refugee issues, Palestinian issues, all kinds of interesting things, and I'll let her just say a little bit about herself.
So my name is Sahar, and I'm the senior analyst for Lebanon with the International Crisis Group. In fact, I've worked before with ICG. I focus on crisis mainly in Lebanon, but also I've worked on Syria, Syrian refugees, the political opposition too. Before, I also worked in the Palestinian camps with the refugees. I also worked on projects related to women with a number of NGOs back in Lebanon.
So how many of you have heard of Al Jazeera? Well, it is really a pleasure to have with us from Al Jazeera, Hebah Abdalla, and she'll tell you a little bit about her background in production and media.
Thank you. My name is Hebah Abdalla. I'm a Washington-based producer for Al Jazeera America. I've been with the company for 10 years and in broadcast television for a little over 20 years. I've worked for all three channels. The Arabic channel helped to launch the English channel, and then now with the American channel. I also serve on an advisory board to the dean at Ohio University, and very much looking forward to today's talk.
So you cannot, in today's world, talk about women just amongst women. So I was rather insistent that we have a male journalist and someone I have enormous respect for, Thomas Gorguissian, who is an Egyptian by birth and has written for Ahram and Tahrir and others, but I'll let you say a word about yourself.
So just first of all, I mean, I don't feel that I'm a stranger among women because I was born and I have 3 sisters and my mother, so they are majority. I'm always minority. I feel myself that way. So in that sense, I mean, as a journalist and as a writer, which most of my life I spent in Egypt, I like to make how I relevant to the issue, or I try to be relevant to the issue. It's like I interviewed and met the last 30 years who was involved in activists and painters and writers and filmmakers, Egyptian women especially. And I, especially in the last 3 years, those who started or who were involved or who drew from the revolution or the Arab Spring. I mean, it's an interesting to have other points of view. And always I said it's good that I am a journalist, or I consider myself a journalist and a writer. So I have always to ask questions more to give an answer to questions. Thank you.
And now a very special guest. Isobel Coleman has been writing about this issue of women for a very long time. And I go back in my mind to Paradise Between Her Feet. And I hope you'll say a word about, I love the title, Paradise Between Her Feet, but recently Pathways to Freedom. She's at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I would also encourage all of you to look up a piece that I think was in Foreign Affairs on women in power and conflict, about women as peacemakers. And it's just, you will find a lot about Isobel Coleman online. But why don't you say a word of introduction?
Thank you. The book is actually Paradise Beneath Her Feet, which for those who know where it comes from is important because it is from one of the hadiths. So, but I have been writing about this topic for a long time, and not necessarily from starting out from a gender perspective or even from a human rights perspective, but more from an economic perspective. My background is in political economy, and I write about the political economy of the Middle East, and I really became interested in this issue of the role of women in society because it is not only a very important human rights and social issue, but a very core economic issue. And so much of what happens in countries, I think, does depend on the investment that is put into women and the opportunities that they're allowed to have.
Well, let us, on that note, begin to look a little bit at the trailer, if we can call up not the trailer, but the initial piece about Women and Girls Lead. And we will put that on and show that to you and then take a pause to hear a little bit more about it.
Sometimes, like, I get picked on at school, but I just tell myself, keep going, keep going. There could be more.
When you look into the reflection of your mirror, I want you to think about how you see yourself and not what everybody else thinks about you.
Right now, this is the beginning.
We want to participate in politics, to be leaders. We want to be equal.
What Catalina's doing is very important. I mean, you can't walk 2 steps without seeing a pregnant child. It's pretty remarkable.
The shuttle's launching and it shakes and it rattles until the solid rocket boosters come out. I remember having this huge grin on my face because I was doing exactly what I wanted to do.
As a woman, the demand for social equality, this is the very essence of feminism. And I knew that it was going to be very hard.
Round of applause for a very beautiful set of clips. I want to begin because the panel's really focused on the post-Arab Spring women and girls. And the basis for a lot of your work is storytelling. So tell me why stories so matter as we talk about the Arab Spring and what's happened.
I mean, I think in general, telling stories about women is always important because it's a story often not looked at, just in the same way that you were talking about not realizing the economic impact that women can have. I feel like a lot of things are covered from, like particularly global security issues are kind of reported from kind of what the battles are and who's won and who's lost, but not really what's happening on the ground in terms of social movement and moving forward. And I feel that women are incredibly key to the region, and they played a really significant role during the revolutions. And they are then the pushback, particularly in Egypt, the pushback has been tremendous. But it's interesting, all of the women that I've met all across the region have uniformly said the exact same thing, which is they did not go into the revolution participating from a gendered perspective or thinking of themselves as women. They really went in as citizens claiming their rights, just alongside their male colleagues. And I think there's been actually a shock to them about the pushback that they got and that it was so gendered. So I just feel that their stories are really important to tell.
Let's start with Egypt, because I think Egypt is such an important test case. And Thomas, we'll go to you and then to others. We've often thought of Egypt as the cradle of civilization, that everything that would happen out of Egypt would really set the tone for the entire region. So tell us a little bit about where the region is and where its women are today.
Okay, if you take the... Oh, sorry, that's me. I have more than one voice. So if you take the scene, let's say if you are now March 2014, just go back March 2013 and then 2012 and 2011. 2011, as a matter of fact, just I recall that moment in the March, especially March 8th, the Women's Day, when some people were gathered in Tahrir Square, people attacked them or cursed them or spit on them or harassed them. All these things happened. If you go back now, if you go forward now, after 2 or 3 years now, 3 years, you can see the same issues are there, which is this is really troubling, confusing, shocking, because the issue of, as she was saying, the issue was not a woman as a woman, and especially with the social role that she has and the economic role, as a matter of fact. There are some statistics saying that 30% of the houses in Egypt are run by the income that women are getting it. So it's like a big chunk of the money, not just the social and the maternity or sisterhood and all these things are going on. It's more than that. The second thing, which is really frustrating, or as a matter of fact, it's when there are some notes of as the agenda of this meeting, it was mentioned promises. I don't think it's a promises. There were no any promises. There were some dreams or expectations, let's say. And in social and social studies, or let's say psychological studies, they said always, great expectation may create great frustrations. And this is a reality.
And this is true across all of the societies emerging from these revolutions. Isobel, can you comment on that? And we'll go down the line. This sense within Egypt that there were great expectations and great hopes, and then for women, but really for everyone, it has not met those expectations, but the women in particular.
Well, again, this is something a theme. This is not a new playbook. This is a scene we've seen before, and I go back to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and that government, and there was tremendous hope and aspirations for the whole society, but women also. And I remember writing a piece on the eve of the U.S. invasion saying, watch out, because this new government will come into power. If it is democratically elected, it will empower the Shia majority. There are many conservative forces in society, and we've seen what that can look like. It can be very detrimental for a whole host of people and rights, and particularly for women's rights. And I wrote almost the same piece right after the fall of the Mubarak regime, because again, a democratic process would bring to power in Egypt, as we saw, an Islamist government that we don't know what type of Islamist government. They're all different types of Islamist governments, but there are trends within that are very conservative and that want to define a role for women in a way that many of those women who were protesting in Tahrir Square would not recognize and would not want. And it is something that we have seen in every country, this tension play out. And in Tunisia, which ironically, it's not Egypt that's leading the way for women, it's Tunisia that's leading the way for women. And in Tunisia, the same battles have played out, but you've ended up in a very different place. And you've ended up through a more consensus process in a place that has defined a more modern role for women in society.
And of course, the key in Tunisia is the constitution, which is helping to enshrine some of these rights. Let me ask our regional experts here, from the ground perspective that you both have, failed expectations, simply a matter of time until we close those expectations? Let me go to Hebah and then Sahar.
Well, in terms of expectations, I can't really speak to, we have gender-neutral newsrooms, we have women in management, we have women who are in the field, but what we've seen, not just from our perspective, but from the perspective of very credible journalism watch groups, a serious decline in conditions for journalists reporting on the ground, particularly in Egypt. And while this has been, the authorities have been sort of equal opportunity offenders in this respect, there's been a particularly heinous targeting of women journalists on the ground, horrific stories of physical attacks, sexual assault, that is really just absolutely abhorrent and unacceptable in any society. And so we're seeing conditions actually worsen and not get better, but I remain hopeful that the situation on the ground will improve and make conditions much more easier for journalists to do their work.
Yeah, I think one issue that the Arab uprising brought is the matter of security and safety. In fact, what we've seen is a space of violence, whether it's like war now, what we're witnessing in Syria, or unrest and violence in other countries like Egypt. And I think this brings the whole issue of women are more vulnerable to violence and to harassment, but the whole society is also suffering from these trends that we're witnessing. And this is a nuance I always, want to stress on, is that it's not specific to women, but it happens that women suffer more because they are more vulnerable and they are more exposed. And in some situations, they are not the one who takes the decision. They are receptive, or I would say, or just endure the consequences of decisions taken mainly by women, because we are governed by a kind of a patriarchal society.
So, I don't want this to be just a downer discussion, because we're going to get to the point we're talking about entrepreneurs and women changing society. But I do want to have one round, and also to invite you to ask your questions. How do you then translate all that public sentiment into policies and laws and concrete things that close the gap that we've identified between expectations and outcomes? What laws, what has to change? And I'll open that up to any of you.
I can start. Thank you. First of all, to put things in perspective, this the last scene, which is the what we call it, the blue bra woman attack or assault, was done in October 2012. And it was the front page of many newspapers, independent newspapers, as like a shocking, and it was like something we thought about it a lot. The other thing, which is like, before answering your question, that to little bit uplifting thing, it's like what we are trying to say is, okay, always people say, look at the full half of the cup and not the empty of the, but it's the question is, it is full of what? That's a big question. That's why. The second thing, which is the other example, which is always mentioned to me, and whenever I was talking with anybody of these people, women in particular, was like, we are not the same anymore. That the sentence was repeated and repeated and repeated. And this is true, by the way. This is not like we, as we call it, wishful thinking. It's a reality. Not just women, anybody, or the young people all over, even the old people, they are not the same. Okay, and if you give a very traditional analogy, is say the genie is out of the bottle. And the problem, you cannot put the genie back, especially if the bottle is was broken. People did break the bottle, which is whether you call it the system, whether you call it the state, whether you call it everything, it was there. Even that concept, if you see the last year, which is like, whether it's going in the right direction or the wrong direction, I'm not talking about it, and people may discuss about it. Even that concept that there is like a Islamic solution or political Islam that is going to save everything from the authoritarian regime, that concept or illusion or mirage even was shredded. Right or wrong, I'm not talking about that.
So that shredding or that breakage, to cover that, to analyze it, is a big challenge.
It's a tremendous challenge, and I don't mean to contradict my colleague here, but it wasn't just the blue bra incident, the so-called incident. It's numerous reports of women being attacked, and Egyptian women, British women, American women. We have also journalists that remain in jail. We have 3 Al Jazeera journalists who have been in jail since December 29th. And we've seen a rapid deterioration in press freedoms in Egypt, and so I think we still have to be able to face the reality of what's happening so that we can remedy this and find solutions. And I think the number one solution with respect to women and journalists and freedom of expression for everyone is to embrace that there are various views on what Egypt should look like, what it should be. And those views shouldn't be stifled. They should have a platform. Journalists should feel free to cover stories. They should have unfettered access to the streets and to officials. And I think until we really address those, and it has to be a systemic thing, there has to be protections on the street. There needs to be prosecution of these perpetrators of the violence and the sexual assaults. I think that then and only then we can start to see some positive outcomes.
And there are some heroes in this story, might we say, some people who emerged to
form their own organizations to change things. And I think it's important if you could say a word about some of the progress and positive things that have emerged.
I mean, I think, as Isobel pointed out early on, there's a real difference in not all the countries are the same, and it's interesting how different Tunisia is from Egypt in terms of looking for, like, bright lights. And it's also, I think, having interviewed people in both places, I think going into the revolutions that things were very different in Tunisia and Egypt. The people in Tunisia, it came out of a labor movement. They were incredibly well organized. When you talk to people who are key, they speak a different language. They speak like party members. They had a plan of what's going to happen today, what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen the next day. And I think the fact that women had such a high place in society before, you can actually hear it in the storytelling of our characters, is that the women from Tunisia actually assume a better place in society. They assume more rights. I think there was an attempt at pushback with them, but they kind of didn't allow it. And I think that the Islamist government that came to place was willing to, seeing what happened in Egypt, seeing the downfall of Morsi, I think that they were willing to reach a negotiation. They don't also have as strong of a military. So, I mean, I think there's lots of differences, but I think looking to Tunisia as ways of resolving things would be positive.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point that Gini's making, which is that the starting point is different in all of these countries for women. And of course, the starting point for women in Tunisia was more advanced in many ways than other countries, legally, from a workforce participation, the economic role of women in the government. So you did have a different starting point. And although the Islamists in Tunisia, the Nada party, did win a plurality of votes, the head of Nada reiterated again and again, women's rights are a fact of life in Tunisia. Rashid Ghannouchi said it again and again. Many of his critics didn't believe him, still don't believe him, think that there are ulterior motives there. But I actually take his perspective at face value, because it is a fact of life in Tunisia. You really can't roll the clock backwards. I know that there are, having done lots of interviews in Tunisia, there are some who would like to, but I think the mainstream approach today in Tunisia is that you can't roll the clock backwards. And to come up with that consensus-driven constitution, they made a decision very early on that they would not explicitly reference Sharia in the constitution. Very, very different from what the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt. They had a very different approach and went down a very different route. And we saw in this clip, women saying now they're talking about bringing back polygamy and they're talking about child marriage. And that's true. These things were being discussed in the parliament in in Egypt. And you had the Muslim Brotherhood saying, something like FGM, which has been illegal in Egypt for years, although, over 90% of women have been cut still, making comments like, well, maybe it shouldn't be illegal, and running vans around town, to do it at a subsidized rate. All these very mixed messages on these things. And you also have had, again, the violence it has come from across the political spectrum in Egypt. And the last thing I would say is I do agree that this genie is out of the bottle, that the one bright thing that you could see in Egypt is that there is now a level of mobilization and awareness among men and women on these issues, which I don't see going away. I mean, it's very fraught, full of tension, but I don't see those issues going away.
Well, I want to widen the region out beyond just Egypt and Tunisia and talk a little bit, sorry to raise Syria, but I don't think we can talk about this region without talking about Syria and the spillover effect, particularly for refugees in so many countries. And so I'm going to ask Sahar to address that and then ask some of you to please have your questions ready.
As I said, women in the Syrian conflict have been, I would say, much more affected because they are the main population who had to flee. They weren't, the one combating. So we had, for example, in Lebanon, waves of refugees, more than 1 million now refugees in Lebanon. And I don't have the specific number, but more than the majorities are women and children.
And I just want to pause for folks. Lebanon's a country of 5 million.
Yeah,
We're
more
ta-
than 20% of the
1
population is not.
million refugees in a country of 5, just so that people really stare at that.
And I would add, in a country that really has an eroding state, I would say, not a failed state, but an eroding state, no institutions, a very polarized society that cannot really deal with major issues like a refugee crisis in an institutionalized way. So what we've seen in Lebanon, for example, is that refugees, and I've did a report on refugees, and I've talked to women, one woman telling me that she spent with 3 babies or 1 infant and 2 babies, like days on the street because she didn't know where to go. She didn't have any means and no one to help her. And I've seen these phenomenon, I mean, all over the country. What happens specifically with refugees is that, with women refugees, is that they found themselves in a way exposed and unprepared to a situation. You know, they have to feed for their children, they have to take care for the family in a very crisis situation. They weren't prepared in advance. You know, I always tend to say that because we experienced the war in Lebanon, that the war in a way also empowered women, I would say, of course, between brackets, because I mean, women took up lead roles in a way, whether it's with disappear during the wars or, you know, with all different issues. But what we're witnessing now with refugees, they are faced with this situation where they have many children in a society that is also very hostile in a way, and they are unprepared in all different means, I would say.
Do we tell the refugee stories well in print and television and documentaries? I feel like there is a void, a vacuum, and I do want to ask both of you about whether we're really, print and broadcast, really getting the story of these women refugees.
Definitely not. I mean, because it's, you know, as always, when things come, as always I said and reminded by people and reminding people, when things become just statistics, doesn't mean anything. Everything has to have a face, as I say it when I teach journalism schools, people, students, they say it has to have a name and a face and story to tell. Otherwise, it's statistics. And even like Stalin in Soviet time, he was saying in the same way, not just about refugees, he said, okay, if I kill somebody, it's a crime. If I kill thousands, it's statistics. So this statistics has to be reflected. I mean, we are talking about almost now 2 million, more than that, Syrian refugees all over the place. And it's definitely when I say the story has to be told, because we are talking about people who left their house and they are not sure where they are going and they are not sure if they are going back. I mean, it's now, to be homeless is not an easy issue to anybody. Set aside homeless in a different land. We don't know if like people who embrace them because they like them or because they hate the person who kicked them out.
Or because they don't have any choice.
Or this is the border that you can cross.
You would think this for television, for Al Jazeera, we would see this day in and day out.
Well, certainly we've done quite a bit of coverage of the refugee situation, but what's been very difficult to cover physically and for security reasons are the internally displaced people within Syria. And there are a lot of untold stories. There are organizations that are managing to get in through fixers and sneaking in cameras. Frontline just ran an amazing piece about children in Syria. I would highly encourage you to watch that if you have an opportunity to see it. But it's an incredibly dangerous place. It is ranked #1 in terms of being the most dangerous place in the world to cover. And so it remains a challenge for all news organizations.
Questions from the floor, because this is really, yes. And just introduce yourself and what you're studying or working on.
Hi, my name is Nadia. I'm from the Tahrir Institute. My question might be directed more towards Thomas and Hebah, but You had touched on it before about the differences between Tunisia and Egypt coming out of their revolutions, and sometimes in the media and in press, the nuances of the history kind of get a little bit lost in the haste of reporting breaking news. And especially if we're looking between Tunisia and Egypt, I think we're all getting tired of the comparisons of what can Tunisia learn from Egypt, what can X learn from Y. And so I just, I'm interested in how you reconcile those nuances and how you represent each country and each country's history in a fair and nuanced way.
Isabel, I'll go to you. It is hard to generalize about women. It's hard to generalize about women. It's hard to oversimplify about regions, even within countries. So I think you're asking, the hard question, which is these subtle differences that we try to deal with as scholars, as writers, as journalists, as documentary makers, without dumbing it down, if that sums up.
Well, for someone who focuses on the Middle East, they're not subtle differences. They're enormous differences. And yet I do appreciate that your general audience, particularly here in the United States, really doesn't understand those differences, probably couldn't identify Tunisia on a map, and really has trouble making those distinctions across countries. And yet they are really, really different. I mean, Yemen is a country we haven't talked about at all, but Yemen just went through its national dialogue process that actually had something in it that was really quite a step forward for women, and that is they made a recommendation to the group that will write the Constitution to ban child marriage. Now, it seems kind of medieval that girls as young as 7, 8, 9 years old are being married in Yemen, but that is the reality. And it is there has been an effort over the past, I'd say almost decade now, women's groups and human rights groups in Yemen to institute a law to ban child marriage, and the main Islamist group Islah has blocked it. But coming out of this national dialogue process, the recommendation was made to implement a law to ban child marriage, and Islah spokesperson said, we will accept that. And that is a huge step forward for Yemen, okay? Not for other countries, Other countries crossed that Rubicon many, many decades ago. And in Tunisia, the laws that have been in place since 1956 for women predate laws that we had in this country. Abortion was legalized in Tunisia before it was in the United States. There was a female Supreme Court justice in Tunisia before there was in the United States. So we're talking about two very, very different countries. Tunisia at one end of the spectrum. I would put Yemen at the other end of the spectrum. And the other thing is, when you look at literacy rates, Yemen has one of the lowest female literacy rate, has the lowest female literacy rate in the Middle East, and it has one of the largest gender gaps in literacy rates between men and women of any country in the world. And that right there tells you how low the status of women is in the country, that the inclination is to educate boys over girls at such a higher rate. So just a couple statistics to help contextualize how very different these countries are. And I can appreciate how difficult it is to report on that, because you can't even begin to tell the story without some backstory.
Yeah, I want to add, even within one country, a lot of people, I heard from a lot of people, even they said, I didn't realize that there are too many Egyptians, too many kinds of Egyptians, as a matter of fact, in the last 2 years. Because it's like people who are living in the city, different from rural areas, different Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, people who are educated abroad, different, looking from... People living in abroad doesn't mean that they are thinking like Western societies. They are sometimes more radical than the people who are living in Cairo in their concept. And then, of course, we come with other realities. Definitely there is no... Because, it's always this is easy way to pigeonhole societies and countries and say, oh, is this like the movie that I saw it the other day? No, it's not the same. There is a different movie.
Can I just just having done so many talks about the Middle East and the Arab revolutions over the last several years, the thing that I hear often, or I did in 2011, even into 2012, from Americans was, I didn't know Mubarak was a dictator, and I didn't know the Egyptians didn't like him. So you know, where do you start?
In fact, I just want to add that, as you said, I mean, you have different layers within each society, and you have like the rural versus urban, you have religious versus secular, and in fact, within women, you have the same also, I would say, divisions or categorizations, and this is also reflects on in all the different countries with different levels, I would say. Generation, exactly.
Yeah, and also really social media's lent itself to creating a platform for everyone to have a voice. And so we have two programs, one for the International English Language Channel as well as for the American channel called The Stream, that brings in voices from the ground, people who don't necessarily are associated with a think tank or a government institution, but what we call in our newsroom real people, being able to talk about what things are like in places like Syria and Tunisia and Yemen and so forth. And so I think we're seeing more and more efforts also, not just for media, but for activists and women's rights groups that are creating apps like, I think in Egypt they have something called Harass Map, where women upload reports of where they've been attacked and that sort of thing, as a way to sort of give them a voice, you know, to the voiceless, but also to serve as a warning to others. So I'm hoping and I'm encouraged by that and hoping to see more of it.
In fact, I just want to add one thing that's, in fact, it affects women. It's an example from Lebanon that affects women but is not directly related to women. We have women groups that have been fighting for years now to enable women to pass the Lebanese nationality to their children, because in Lebanon, the men can pass the nationality but not women. And it has been blocked in the parliament over and over. And in fact, it's not, this specific example is not against women themselves, but it's because of the refugee population that we have and the fear that, it's kind of ridiculous, but there's the fear mainly among the Christian community in Lebanon that more women will marry Palestinians and then will pass their nationality to children. So it's the kind of, twist of situations that really makes situation even worse for women.
Yes, thanks, Tara. Steve Steiner, now with USIP, but formerly with the State Department. And my question is specifically on Egypt in the first instance, but applies to all countries. I don't mean all countries in the Middle East, but all countries. And that is that Yuval Thomas and the ladies too, you made interesting observations like certain myths being shattered now in Egypt, like women and men both being mobilized to an extent that can't be pushed back. And that's all good, but I want to know, to what extent are men being engaged to support women's rights and opportunities, or are they sort of mobilized separately? I mean, can they work together?
So the power relationship is always... Yeah.
Well, I'll just give you an anecdote. I work for the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and we often host State Department groups that are coming through, that are part of the International Visitors Program. And about a year ago, we had a group of Egyptian filmmakers and civil society leaders in general. Some of them were NGO leaders, but several of them, almost half the group were filmmakers, which is kind of interesting that they have channeled their activism into this medium. And at least half the group was men, and they were all working on films around this topic of sexual violence. It was something that has really motivated and energized them in a way. And I found that quite interesting to hear the men getting so just engaged on this topic and looking at it from a very personal perspective. I will also say, just stepping back and taking a larger perspective, I have worked with many governments around the world, not just in the Middle East, but around the world on these issues. And I think that the people engage on this issue from different perspectives. There is a human rights perspective, but the men engage on this issue most, from my own personal experience, by understanding how important women's empowerment is from an economic angle, from a macroeconomic sense for the whole country. When they look at the data and they're moved by the data in terms of investing in education, in girls' education, closing gender gaps, how that improves the economic prospects for the country, how creating economic opportunities for women. I mean, I will tell you, having spoken to labor ministers for a new book I'm writing on employment in the region, talking to labor ministers, I get this reaction, oh, well, how can we try to provide jobs for women? We can't provide jobs for men. And I then show them the data that those countries that have the highest level of female employment have the lowest levels of unemployment, because it's not a zero sum. Women who are active in the economy are creating jobs for other women and for men. And so then that begins to really get their attention and to think about it in a different way.
Hi, PJ Crowley, also a fellow at the IPDGC. To what extent right now do women see democracy and women's rights as zero sum? Picking up on Isobel's point that there's a track record here that dictators and kings have been better in terms of advancing women's rights than democracies. That's one aspect, and the other is, as societies do become more participatory, what is the dynamic inside a household where men are still intimidating women in terms of who they will be allowed to vote for?
Do you want to start a little bit down the line? I think that for the young women that I've met, there's no difference between democracy and women's rights. I think that it is true that under the dictators that a lot of women's rights were advanced, and there's a lot of animosity between young women and what they call the state feminists. I think that that's definitely a shift, and that's part of the reason that I think a lot of young women did not want to identify with feminism or with having a gendered perspective. But they see their rights as human rights, and they see democracy for men and human rights for men just as important. I mean, I had one woman say to me, I don't want to be equal to someone who's not equal, to someone who's oppressed. So they definitely want human rights for all. And in the question of families, I mean, one of the main character that we're following in Egypt, she's a young woman who's from a village, and she was sneaking to Cairo to go to the demonstrations, and she got, the same day that the woman with the blue bra was beat up, she was arrested and beat up and tortured. And that's when her family found out. She's been kicked out of her family, which is a huge deal within Egyptian society. She's kind of she's actually still facing charges that stem from that day. And she's kind of alone, but I kind of feel that's how things go for Hind is very representative of how things will go for Egypt, because she's challenging the roles that she was supposed to play. She's kind of fighting for democracy for all. She's trying to end torture. So I kind of think that she's like a key player.
Yeah, I think there's also the issue of, like the state-sponsored, I would say, feminist association that have been kind of first enhanced patronage in a way, this clientelist relation also between women and the system, which is kind of problematic in a way. And it also created gaps because it only benefited, in a way, restricted numbers. And it didn't really reflect reality, even though, I mean, there's this whole heated debate about the rise of militancy, Islamism. I think at least it's bringing debate into the public, it's not like imposed. And I think it will let the society find out societies in general found out which are the better ways, to deal with these inequalities. In my
just to echo my sentiments from earlier, I think it begins with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, to be able to enable everyone, not just women, a platform to share their political views, their thoughts, their visions, their hopes for the future. And I think until we have that, we can't hold our in any society, we can't hold our public officials to account if we don't have the information.
So first of all, I can assure what she said before, that not just women, a lot of men even, they didn't tell their parents or young that they are going out to the demonstrations, because that was the choice between accept what is there or create a new reality, or at least get rid of the old reality. And this is the main challenge now facing it. But the main issue, which is like always, this is what is missing in our, not just discussion, in our generally approach to these things. Either people are focusing on the trees without looking to the forest, or people looking at the forest and missing the trees. It needs people who look to both of them and see not just the trees as the trees, and the leaves and the roots and the fruits and whatever is there, and the shadow and the movement of the sun and sunset and all these things. And this is really a hard work. And that's why, even as she was mentioning, is that comparison between Egypt or Tunisia. It's like if you ask a geologist, oh, it's a bunch of stones there. They are not stones. Or like in old days, they were talking about Soviet Union, former Soviet Republic, 16 of them. It's like the pink states, pink countries, which is not pink. I mean, it's like the Islamic world or the Arab world. I mean, every culture has a different culture. Every society has a different, whether it's a geography, whether it's the geography revenge, as Copeland said, or whether it's the history curse or the Pharaoh's curse, whatever you are, it's a different. I can tell you, I mean, a lot of times we have discussions with Arabic, we among each other, like from different countries, and we look how, especially after the last 3 years, how different we are. But doesn't mean that we are disagreeing with each other, but they are different. They are different people. They are not the same.
So I promised we would come to some positive to let your day be a little bit more upbeat. And I want to give the panel a chance to talk about what either positive stories have emerged from the region, or where you think, if we have this discussion together again in 1 year or 2 years, firstly, things take time. And I think we live in a 24/7 rushed environment. We would like to have this story, a new storyline by tomorrow, but we won't. But what are some of the positive trends and the things that we can hope for and take some confidence in?
I mean, I think I would totally agree with what Thomas said, that everyone that I've talked to has said we broke through the barrier of fear, and that will never, ever exist for us again. And people feel that they're talking about things. That it's also true about sexual harassment. It's something that young people are really taking up in Egypt. It's being talked about. And when you say, like, things take time, I think, like, what did it take us 13 years to write our Constitution? And that was when there was very few people living here, and there wasn't 24-hour-a-day kind of coverage. So I think, I'm not feeling very optimistic about the situation in Egypt at the moment, but I do think that the young people and the people who participated are not giving up.
I think in general it's too soon to draw conclusions yet. I mean, the situation in all the Arab countries and where you have uprising, I always witness very mixed and heated discussions about the positives and the negatives for women and for the population in general. In my view, it's really too soon to draw conclusion, and I think there's a change. I'm not sure how to describe it, but there's something that has been exactly maybe the fear, the aim for dignity and for freedom, and this, I feel like confident that you cannot bring it back to what it was before.
Well, for better or for worse, we're going to continue to cover the region. Certainly, the challenges posed upon us make it that much more difficult, but we'll continue to report finding creative solutions to that. On my most recent trip to Egypt, I did get a sense of much more engagement, much more interest in the political process, and I think that's the genie in the bottle that Thomas and others have been referencing, and that people now suddenly feel that they can affect change in their leadership, and that is something I think will not go away. How long this process will take before the dust settles is unclear, but I guess I could say tune in, stay tuned.
So. I mean, just so I will take her word, which is cover. I always say I'm going to uncover, because I don't.
One of you will cover the news and one will uncover it. Okay.
Because it's like, especially in that part of the world, a lot of things are covered. I mean, state-wise, even when we are talking now about social media, I mean, tweeting and all these things, and this has really become a tool even used by the dictators or governments or whoever they want to impose their ideas, even, because, as we said, in using the music language, there is a big difference between music and noise. I mean, and if you don't know the difference, I mean, we have a problem with our ears, and there is a need to listen to music. The other thing which is really it's important, I mean, whether definitely it's too soon to conclude, because nobody make a conclusion. But definitely there are a lot of people asking questions. There are a lot of people discussing it, and this is one of the things. Good things happen. It's not just that they break the fear barrier. They come out and discuss. And as a matter of fact, one of the best expressions I heard is like, it's too hard now to be a dictator. It's too hard to be a dictator. I mean, it's like, it was easy before, because it was like, okay, we are going to stay and we do whatever we want to do. But now it's hard to be a dictator, and this is the reality. I mean, and then just back to the question of this: if men are talking about the women issues, yes, and definitely all of us in Egypt, whether inside or outside, and those who are involved, and especially the young people, that's the point. I mean, the young people is like, it's like the main thing I was thinking when I was coming to this discussion, what can I say? Okay, is that the sense of, when we are talking about management and we say this, I want you to have the sense of ownership instead of like managing things, ownership. I think that feeling is, especially among young people, is really obvious. Whether they know how to do it, that's another issue. I'm not discussing that. But that sense of ownership, I mean, and if sometimes even to the extent that it's really polarized, you say, if you don't like it, don't sit with us. Go away, where you were staying. I mean, I'm going to do this newspaper. I'm going to publish this television. I'm going to launch this television. I'm going to do this party. And this is the main feeling, which is like, I feel it and I see it, and I really, to be frank with you, I enjoy it. Maybe you don't enjoy it, that's your problem. I mean, it's like, I enjoy it.
Well, just addressing the question of what is positive. I mean, I think it's hard sometimes to see the positive beneath the very negative headlines. And we saw some of the negative clips, and people, that's what the news is often the negative stories. And you see women being dragged through the streets and sexual harassment and all sorts of very real and negative things that are happening. But to step back and take, again, a big picture view, if you look at the last 25 years for women in the Middle East, they've made remarkable gains. And again, starting in some countries from a very low position, a very low starting point, they've made remarkable health gains, remarkable educational gains, and they're beginning to make gains politically and in the workforce. And again, different country by country. But those things, when you lay the foundation of increased education for women and increased economic opportunity for women, then other things follow. And it can take a very long time. We know that in our own country. You know, women started going to college at high rates in the first half of the 20th century. But it wasn't really until the later decades in the 20th century that they began to make real gains, both politically and in the workforce and senior management positions. And you're beginning to see that across the Gulf countries. You're seeing many women moving into leadership positions in companies. I can't tell you how many fathers have said to me, well, I always thought my son would take over the family business, but he's racing cars in the desert, and my daughter just graduated from Stanford Business School, and she's going to run the business, And there's a sense of tremendous pride. This is true when you look at the women who are moving into positions of leadership. A woman just was elected head of a political party in Egypt for the first time. You've seen women, the use of political quotas to jumpstart that process of getting women into the political sphere. In Tunisia, the women have 25% of the parliament, a significantly higher share than we do here in the United States. You're seeing quotas in a lot of different countries. They're not a silver bullet by any means. You bring lots of women into office who have conservative views and don't necessarily want to promote a women's agenda, but you are normalizing a political role for women and creating a next generation of leaders. So I see tremendous gains across the whole spectrum.
Well, I'm not going to try to improve upon that except to suggest that all of you tweet about this event. There's a hashtag ArabWomenGW. There is a Twitter at IPDGC. I will certainly tweet at Sonenshine. I hope everyone here will tweet and will retweet so that everyone out in the rest of the world can hear these amazing perspectives. I want you to join me in thanking an extraordinary panel. Thank you all very much.